So now we've understood a little bit about the initial built environment of the place that becomes Panama City. I want to talk about the environmental and ecological history of the place. So this is now starting to cover off that aspect of our broad interest in the political ecology of the city. Now, obviously, it's necessary to sort of talk about one topic at once. We can't talk about, or it's very hard to talk about the political ecology in one sort of big interrelated smudge of information. But hopefully, as I talk through these various sections, you're starting to understand how by building our knowledge of a place, sort of layer on layer, maybe starting with the material space, and then understanding the sort of the social meaning that gets laid upon that. We can then start moving to think, well, what is the environmental impact of this in different ways? How are environmental resources moving and flowing around the city? How does the city then start to create management systems for that? And therefore, what kind of outcomes are then happening for different types of people? So that's the sort of the environmental justice lens that gets put on top, and then our interest in society and how different social groups use the urban space and the resources available in different ways for different outcomes, and of course subject to different power structures. So, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. So this is I'm really excited about this slide. I hope you are. Does this look exciting? Well, I'm excited. I don't care about you. So I've made this graph myself. So this is part of the original research that I've been trying to do as my professional work as an academic. And I want to share it with you. And I'm be most excited if you're interested in getting involved to help me develop this. It isn't particularly complicated. I have to say, I'm not claiming that this is in any way technically highly accomplished. Or particularly insightful, but I think it's interesting, indicative, and it's a place to start. So I've taken just one source, and that source itself is drawn on other sources, and it provides some indication to different population levels over time. It talks, interestingly, both about the human population level, but also the number of cattle that were around at similar points. And then also talks about the forest coverage. So thinking about people in the light green line, we have this. And we can see that as well as human populations being introduced into Panama, and I think it's fair to say specifically the area around Panama City, although this data is for the whole country, I think knowing what I know about the country at the time and its administrative capacity and those people who are building records, this is most likely to pretty much mean Panama City and not very far beyond that. So as well as the growth in human population, we're also getting a growth in the introduced cattle population. So Europeans brought all sorts of new hooved animals, including horses, over from Europe. And they also brought cows and pigs, introduced for the first time onto the continental landmass. And in Panama, this population grows, and we can probably understand the relationship here between population and food need, local food need, as well as the opportunity for exporting food, possibly because of Panama's global connection. And particularly around 1950, something here in particular is happening in terms of the injection of finance into cattle ranching and whatever, as part of an export market as well as domestic consumption. So there's a human population and cattle population grow. The orange line, now this, to be transparent, only has 3 data points, but this is percentage of forest coverage. So while the population figures for humans and for cattle are on the left-hand side, we've got the percentage coverage. Now, this isn't quite right, so this should be whole numbers. So this is 0.2 would be 20%. So we can see that way back, according to the data and according to this very rough and not particularly rigorous trend lines that I've put in here, we can see that while this relationship is not necessarily causal based on the statistics, there is definitely a relationship between increasing people, increasing capital, and decreasing forest cover. Although I would, of course, go as far to say, based on the qualitative knowledge I have about this period, is that there is very much a causal relationship between these different variables. So I'm going to make this spreadsheet available if anyone, for their output for their photo essay for this unit, wants to write about Panama City. Absolutely, that would be amazing. And if anyone wanted to sort of continue to work on this data, to create new knowledge, to do research, to add more statistics and make this whole thing more robust, that would be even better. If multiple people wanted to do it, that's still great, and you'd all get individual credit for that in terms of the marks, and that would really help collective knowledge, because I can pass all that together, triangulate it together, and create something that comes out of all our analysis, which will obviously be a lot more robust. But hopefully, for the time being, you get the point about what's happening in Panama. If we think about so land use change, deforestation across Panama, this is a more contemporary analysis. But the green box essentially highlights the area around Panama City, and what we can see from this is that the red indicates deforestation in a certain period, and we can see that this deforestation is around Panama City. And this is not to say that the city is now covering all of that red space, but the focus of the city being there, the immediate hinterland, obviously, as we can understand, there are incentives for greater levels of deforestation. But Panama is hugely interesting for so many reasons, and one of them is this: that as you will recall, the Panama Canal route, as constructed by the American interests, created a 10-mile stretch of land which was essentially sovereign to the United States to operate the canal. Now, part of the reason that this was necessary, yes, there was sort of the physical security of the canal, I guess, from an international relations, geopolitical point of view, but also the canal only functions as long as it has sufficient water in the lakes, the natural lakes and the artificial lakes that were created through the flooding of, through the damming of various rivers. So this water catchment area suddenly becomes utterly integral to the whole international shipping that's running through the canal. If these ecosystem services here get messed up and there's not enough water, then the canal potentially runs dry, or more accurately, reaches a level too low to get the ships through it. So there's a kind of irony here, in the sense that within this stretch of land, forest has been actually pretty well preserved. And if you see pictures of it, which we can do here, so this is the entrance of the river into the Gatun Lake, I think, which you can see on the map. This looks like a pretty well preserved natural, quote unquote, environment. It's not quite true. This is not exactly sort of original forest in its entirety, but this is well preserved forest. The city outside of the zone, however, you can see the red, which is residential areas, of course, becomes a lot more deforested. So some of these red areas around the city, I'm not quite sure where it is, but will be explainable by urban development and the associated needs of that urban space as supply chains and communication routes start to spiral out beyond it. So this is, I think this makes the city particularly fascinating. And of course, the city only exists because of the canal. So the story has to be told as an interrelated one. So just to sort of to formalize this, thinking about ecological impact, we've got an increased anthropogenic human-caused rise in population, which is both people and cattle. I think it's worth focusing on them. We've, of course, got the creation of the physical urban space. I've been talking about the Spanish development and how the city worked. As the canal developed, as the urban space developed, as the American interests required more and more people to live there, more urban space was created. So here we have an extract from the Panama Canal Review. So it's an annual publication about what's going on from 1951. By 1951, they're still building new buildings and new towns in order to support the operation and running of the canal for the labour that's needed, etc. Um, all of that construction throughout history, of course, has needed natural resources. So mining of stone, cutting of wood, originally growing of thatch, but then production of other materials that in some cases might have been imported, but where there was natural local availability, would have been mined and extracted. Now, you might have covered this with Jonathan, but it also makes intuitive sense. Where we're creating urban space, we are reducing the permeability of the surface. So where we have rain, it is not able to soak and to permeate down into the soil and to work within the hydrological cycles as they would normally be. It tends to wash off much more rapidly, creating the need for kind of storm management in drains and this type of thing. So the ground and the ecosystem underneath the urban space is one of its fundamental resources, and you could look at it in terms of conditions, is changing. And that is, of course, going to change all sorts of things about the rest of that ecosystem. Now, we know that biodiversity will be impacted because both species, large and small, will be driven away. They will be forced out because they will lose that supportive niche, because conditions and resources will not be available. And of course, we know that where one species is impacted, it tends to impact others through the food web. Something you will hopefully remember from environmental principles, and if you did climate change, the concept of albedo, so the idea of how reflective a given surface is. So the higher the albedo reference point, the more reflective. So the less energy incoming gets absorbed. So the less energy that hits and sort of changes wavelength and stays within the global system. But where we get darker colours, so like the asphalt road or concrete or other the human-made materials, we get a lower albedo, so we get less reflection, more absorption, more heat retained initially within the urban space, which creates a condition that we then need to manage through potentially air conditioning and whatever, and urban cooling, but also obviously contributes to the broader effect of global warming and, as we know, climate change. Now, the urban space also relates to the idea of novel entities, which you should remember from environmental principles. And indeed, hopefully you can see here that I don't just forget the things that I learn in environmental principles. I transfer them into my future thinking about other things. So when I think about environmental impact, I don't try and reinvent the wheel. I say, I've got a framework in my head. There are 9 planetary boundaries that I can think through systematically to try to make sure that I capture everything. Now, I haven't quite done that here, but I have used the idea of novel entities. Now, this image relates to a very complex relationship between urban development in Panama and public health. So you might recall that one of the reasons that the French Canal wasn't so successful is because of the transmission of malaria and that's impact on human productivity and human life. Now, when the Americans came along, they brought new technologies that sought to deal with this issue. The sort of malaria was understood, it came out of research done in Cuba, and technologies were applied, including this. Now, this could be the spraying of petrochemicals onto water. Now, the idea here was that the petrochemicals formed a layer that floated on top of the water where mosquitoes laid their eggs, and it stopped the mosquitoes from doing that. So the idea was where you could cover as much stagnant water. If you couldn't get rid of it, you could cover it in this particular layer, which would then reduce the susceptibility for it to incubate mosquitoes. Another process that was used was spraying of DDT, which you will probably recognize is subsequently realized to be one of the most dangerous and unpleasant chemicals that humans have come up with. It's really great for killing stuff, but it's not so great for targeted killing of things. So this creates all sorts of environmental problems with these novel entities in the urban ecology. Something that's fundamentally related to the urban space is the loss of food production opportunities. So because we've got a dense concentration of people which defines an urban space, there is less opportunity to grow and produce food within that. And over time, those opportunities are screened out further and further. So you're probably confined to maybe growing some herbs on your windowsill. If you'd have gone back, or went back 100 years in Britain, people might have grown quite a lot of food in their gardens and in community allotments, etc. So the food system changes. And I'd just like you to have a think. What impacts do you think the development of the urban space in Panama might have had from a food point of view? Particularly if you did the food module, please have a think. And in fact, I tell you what, if you want to pause the video now, just have a little think, as many things as you can, and then restart it. So hopefully you had a bit of a pause, you had a bit of a concentrated think. You might have connected what I told you about Panama and its original population, indigenous communities. One of the, have I told you about that? Or is that the food lecture? I can't remember. Either way, you might have thought independently that indigenous populations might have used a sort of a slash and burn technique. So they would cut down a bit of the rainforest, and they would leave the ashes as a sort of a fertilizing product, and they would use that land for as long as it was fertile, and then they would move on. Now, when the Spanish arrive, this introduces metal tools into this process for the first time, which makes it a lot more efficient and effective to undertake. So there was an increasing opportunity to undertake this sort of practices. And of course, with more people, there was more demand for food. When indigenous communities became connected to the Spanish settlements, which we know they did, they were incentivized to start supplying into a market. So this process brings both the technological capacity, but also the economic and social incentives to clear more of the forest land. Now, I've gone out of my way to stress that the population of cattle increased greatly over Panama's history, particularly imported by the Spanish initially. And what we can see in terms of ecological change is that where forests are removed for the grazing of cattle, we get a creation of what's referred to as this kind of savanna space. There's a whole load of other impacts that are associated with this, so not just the loss of trees, but again the trampling and the hardening of ground, which changes the permeability of the soil and changes the way that the hydrological cycle works, the way that water runs off land and into streams. So it's a quicker flow through the system. Soil erosion can take place, so the plants and the grasses that hold together the soil, because they're not there anymore, the soil can start blowing away, which means we can lose fertile topsoil and fertility from the soil systems. All sorts of implications. And we've got an account here from the 1790s that already starts to identify that where cattle are getting put on the land, it's changing it in a significant way. So the grass is disappearing. There's the land is becoming so hard. There's a risk of breaking horses' legs. The way that water interacts with the soil is changing, and this is noted all the way back in 1790 as an ecological impact. So I would go as far as to say that it is impossible to read the history of Panama City in a meaningful way, and particularly using the political ecology lens, because this is the point. We've got to think about ecology. Fantastic summarizing quote here. So Greater Panama City, so not just the center, but the sort of the urban sprawl around it, I guess. So the modern environment, but I would also say the historical environment, and is inextricably linked with that of both the canal, as I've tried to explain, and its changing political ecology of water. And that also relates to the way that humans were producing food around this land, and the general economy was evolving. It's of course not the case that all this was something that happened way back in the past and didn't continue. The history of the city is related to the continued deforestation of it, which is one of those more contemporary maps that we looked at just now about about deforestation. And again, the Panama Canal Review is a fantastic historical source. So here, a story that's saying, hey, fantastic, there are great bits of wood that we can cut out and sell. We've got access to international markets, we've got the equipment, we can make a good amount of money of this. So here we can see the political economy interacting with the natural world, allowing us and making it appropriate that we think about this not as political economy, but about political ecology.